Described by many as the ultimate evil, the end of mankind, but by others as a tool for righteousness and instrument of diplomacy. During the latter half of the 20th century, two nuclear titans, the US and USSR, clashed against each other, getting closest to the start of the nuclear war in October of 1962.
The debate of containment versus avoidance of war by both sides of the Cold War dictated diplomacy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and global nuclear policy afterwards. The US's opposition of communism and need to avoid confrontment led to a tactical nuclear increase, while leaving the Soviet Union to move missiles into Cuba and to bring them to the edge of war. However, the panic of the crisis led both sides to pursue a diplomatic policy which reduced the threat of global nuclear war, but did nothing to stop their ideological opposition.
In 1959, a revolution in Cuba had allowed the regime to change into one that supported and allied with communist Russia. Seeing this as a threat, Kennedy had made it very clear to the American public and to his advisors that the presence of communist supporters in his own backyard would be met with force.
Or if Cuba should ever attempt to export its aggressive purposes by force or the threat of force, then this country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security.
In 1961, counter-revolutionaries, supported by the US, landed on Cuban shores and failed to overthrow the government in what would be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion later. Later that year, President Kennedy would authorize Operation Mongoose, which had a similar purpose to the Bay of Pigs invasion, to covertly outthrow the Cuban revolutionaries. Fidel Castro, in his later years, recalls this as a war constituting of US organized terrorism on Cuban soil.
Thousands of miles eastwards, US missiles had been placed on Turkish and Italian soil, right on the border of the USSR and well within range to strike most of the country. This was part of a large missile gap that was heavily in the US favor in terms of striking capability, especially with the missiles in Turkey. To Khrushchev, this left a need for action, one that would demonstrate his support for revolutionaries near America, one that would show the US that the Soviets could fight back, and one that would even the playing field. Prompted by his belief that the new president wouldn't possibly threaten nuclear war, Khrushchev arranged the secret transportation of missiles to Cuba.
The threat of nuclear missiles, which had been confirmed by lead experts by the evening of October 16th, would warrant immediate action. Figures like Robert Kennedy, although he slightly denies it in his book 13 Days, were initially very adamant about an invasion of Cuba to secure all possible missile launch points and to remove the communist threat in the Western Hemisphere. Both military opinions would help diplomacy with NATO. The alliance would trust the US would stand its ground against the communists, especially where it mattered to Kennedy the most, Berlin. On the other hand, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, had proposed a blockade to keep the missiles out of Cuba. The quarantine became the agreed solution. After multiple switching of opinions, RFK, Dean Rusk's Secretary of State, and Adlai Stevenson, ambassador to the UN, had all agreed that a missile strike would be immoral, like the one at Pearl Harbor. Despite having the moral force of fighting communism, none of the three thought that a surprise attack would be within their right.
Nikita Khrushchev did not expect such aggressive action and thus became very upset and worried about nuclear war. His initial reaction was to tell ships to run the blockade that the US had created. However, he was still very intent on managing things through diplomacy. In the next 2 days, he would send a letter to Kennedy denouncing the blockade as an act of war, and stating that Kennedy was making a violation of international waters. Khrushchev would receive certification from the Presidium to arrange for a trade of missiles for an agreement that the US wouldn't invade Cuba.
An emergency UN meeting would occur, during which the US ambassador Stevenson would attempt diplomatic talks about the missiles, which the Russian ambassador Zorn continuously denied. This combined with the running of the quarantine, which still convinced many in the ex-com that the Soviets were stalling for time, and that invasion or airstrikes were still necessary options. Thus, troops continued getting shipped to Florida, and for the only time in American history, alert was raised to DEFCON 2. Castro saw this and let Khrushchev and Cuba know that invasion was imminent. The missile operation was sped up and Cubans prepared for war.
Diplomacy appeared possible to both leaders. However, when Secretary General of the UN, U Thant, had received agreements from Kennedy to stop any confrontations at sea, and from Khrushchev to turn on his ships, Kennedy was still heavily leaning on military action. The missiles were operational in a very short time, and the ex-com and American public were now convinced they had to get rid of the missiles now or never. Operating completely separate from both the president and Khrushchev, ABC correspondent Scully and former head of KGB Vexilov, Conan Foman, would propose diplomacy by agreeing to not invade Cuba in response for removal of nuclear weapons. Both would report back to the respective governments, opening up another diplomatic channel. With Khrushchev's letter offering that same deal, Kennedy had figured an opportunity had opened.
The following day, the crisis suddenly escalated. In the morning, American time, Khrushchev had initially thought US invasion was imminent. After realizing it was not, he tried to show a stronger side to the world and would declare by radio that he would be willing to accept a deal for the Turkish missiles. Moving the missiles would not be negotiable in this short amount of time. For Italy and other NATO allies, the moving of the missiles would mean they couldn't trust the US to protect them. Thus, to preserve trust in NATO, the ex-con members would respond to Khrushchev's proposal the night before, the non-invasion pledge.
On that same day, Fidel Castro had asked for preemptive nuclear strikes against the US, which Khrushchev denied with great concern that such a ridiculous idea would be proposed. Khrushchev had not ordered the shooting down of the U-2 plane, and in a similar fashion to JFK, he authorized the military buildup while hoping not to engage. Khrushchev would remark to his son that he needed Kennedy to see this, and the fact that he did not want war. Kennedy did not trust the new letter plan and instead proposed to a closed circle of committee members that they should privately pursue the missile swap. Dean Rusk would even suggest that RFK open the possibility to Dobrinin, along with the threat that if any more US planes were shot down or they refused to yield, the invasion would begin. Little did they know that Khrushchev did not want any military action, but the Russian government had approved retaliatory nuclear strikes while the Cubans fired on planes without Khrushchev's direct command. Rusk and JFK even made a diplomatic backup plan. They would propose the swap publicly to U-Thant, reducing chances that the Russians would deny the deal. In a sense, both Russia and the US had abandoned their weapons commitment to their allies for the sake of diplomacy, and both sides desperately hoped that the anti-war message was clear.
In the morning of the 28th in Moscow, after receiving Kennedy's message from Dobrinin and the letter, Khrushchev finally decided to trust in diplomacy and ordered that the missiles immediately be dismantled. The risk of war was too great for him, but he was on a clock. Kennedy had yet to heed military action. In desperation, Khrushchev announced publicly that he would remove the missiles. Kennedy was relieved. In effect, the crisis was over as the missiles in Cuba were no longer a threat. Although inspection of missiles and removal from Turkey in the following months was complicated, the threat of nuclear war was significantly reduced, and the two leaders saw that they could both communicate to reduce threat of nuclear war.
In letters sent during November and December, both Kennedy and Khrushchev looked to create a nuclear test ban treaty, one that would successfully reduce nuclear-armed tensions. Khrushchev, as described by his son, really was willing to commit to slowing Soviet missile production. He had succeeded in protecting his assets, including his weak points in Berlin and Turkey, and didn't believe that war with the US was any more necessary. Kennedy also shared the sentiment that nuclear war could now be reduced as a threat with the elimination of missiles in the Western Hemisphere. The crisis had still left a very bitter taste to both administrations. Khrushchev, who had publicly conceded to the US, was under harsh criticism that the Soviet Union was submitting to the US, failing to truly gain an advantage over the US from the missile gap and losing the missiles in Cuba for only the shaky promise of non-invasion. Castro himself personally felt abandoned, and the Russian protection of new communist countries like Cuba felt far more untrustworthy.
The US had luckily received less criticism as the Turkey deal was private and still had trust from the NATO members. Kennedy and harsh anti-communists still felt that Cuba was a thorn on their side, actually worsening their situation by legally requiring that they cannot attack Cuba. Still, they created plans to sabotage and overthrow Castro. Although the leaders believed in a nuclear weaponless future, their governments and alliances did not. It was quite an impressive feat that they managed to prevent war with a larger diplomatic context of alliances and clashing ideological sentiment, but even two diplomatic leaders would only be able to slow down nuclear weapons production briefly. In fact, after Kennedy died, Russia would go back to producing large amounts of missiles, eventually turning the warhead count in their favor, fearing the humiliation they suffered during the crisis.
Meanwhile, American government officials were convinced that they couldn't allow a similar situation to happen, and thus needed to control any governments in which such an exchange could happen again. Castro, much to his benefit, would live on and govern for many years after, and Turkey would stay confident in the US. Even after the Soviet collapse and into the modern day, the Cuban Missile Crisis warned countries enough to stay away from nuclear engagements, but prompted enough fears from both sides to produce much more effective ICBMs, which would not need to be placed near a country to strike it. NATO countries and other smaller ones still understand that the presence of nuclear weapons can serve as effective deterrent and continuously confront each other with the same threats made years ago. Although diplomacy during the crisis had helped reduce the overall count of missiles in the USSR and US and prevent a nuclear war, it left many desired objectives and did little to stop the continuous use of the nuclear weapons as the most valuable asset of global superpowers.